Thanks, Rahila. Hi, everybody. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about what's happening with vaccines and what kind of timelines we might be working on. So Canada, as you may have read in the news or heard in the news, has deals with 7 manufacturers to purchase vaccines, 3 different kinds of vaccines. So the first ones that have been or are being approved are what are called mRNA vaccines, and that's the Pfizer, BioNTech, and the Moderna products. There's 2 viral vector vaccines coming, AstraZeneca that you've probably seen results from, and one made by Janssen. And then there's 3 of the older technology vaccines of protein with adjuvant, one from a pooled project from Sanofi and GSK, one from Novavax, and one from a Canadian manufacturer called Medicago. All of those protein vaccines are further behind. Next slide. So the really important message about vaccines now, we're expecting that sometime in the next month, some of these vaccines are going to be available for long-term care residents and staff. And there is a lot of anxiety, I think, everywhere about what we know about these vaccines and how sure we can be about these vaccines. And I think that's going to be particularly true in the staff of long-term care facilities. So one of the things we need to be thinking about is what we can do to support vaccination in staff of long-term care to protect staff and residents. And I think the first important message about vaccine development, what's scary about vaccine development is how quick it's been, right? We went from not knowing about the virus to having a vaccine that people are going to be asked to take inside of a year. And normally, it's at least 10 years from when somebody has a vaccine developed until they get it licensed and we're ready to use it. So the first thing I think people need to understand is that this is not changing our vaccine development process. It's just making it work faster. And there's a bunch of reasons why it's worked so much faster. The first is that we've all been doing pandemic planning, some of us more seriously than others. And one of the pandemic planning things that vaccine manufacturers and government regulators have been doing is planning for how to accelerate the vaccine process. So there's a very set series of steps that have been set up to try to make sure that we take every barrier to progress out in the making of vaccines. The second thing is that everybody has been working 24/7. So vaccine manufacturers recognized that we were going to need a vaccine in the second week of January last year. And people doing vaccine development have literally been working 24/7, okay? Sleeping in shifts in hotel rooms so that they can keep all of the processes going. There's a whole long series of them that you have to do when you're developing vaccines to make sure that you have good quality control and you know what your antigens are and you have the same concentration in every batch. And normally people do that peacefully, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That's not how it's been working. And the third thing is that everybody's been working together on this so that vaccine companies started with regulators. Normally, because vaccines fall by the wayside on their way, you don't take a vaccine package to a country regulator seriously until it's nearly ready. But in this setting, people started right at the beginning. So the vaccine regulators have been getting information about these vaccines since February or March. And so it's not like they suddenly got the whole package last week and they've done it in 4 days. They've been seeing the data as it comes so that they can make a decision quickly when a decision is ready to be made. And you also see people working together who don't normally work together. Okay, so GSK and Sanofi are competitors, okay? They usually have no interest in working together, but it turns out that between them, they have an antigen and an adjuvant that are really good, and so they're working together. So these are really exceptional times in terms of what people have done to make this work. And then the final reason, which is small silver lining, okay, for vaccines is that it looks like vaccines against this virus are really easy to make. There's some vaccines, so think, we don't have vaccines against HIV, we don't have vaccines against group-A strep, we don't have vaccines against malaria, because those vaccines are really hard to make. But it's easy to make vaccines against tetanus, and even measles, mumps, rubella wasn't that hard. So one of the saving graces of this coronavirus is really looks like vaccines, lots of different vaccines are going to work. They're not hard to make. So people need to hear that next slide. There's been no shortcuts in this process, okay? The vaccines are meeting exactly the same standards that any other vaccines meet. It's just that we've been working to accelerate them. So if you think about it, we didn't know until last week that the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines were going to work. Under normal circumstances, you wait until a vaccine works before you start producing it. But what people did in this circumstance was they said, okay, if these vaccines work, we're going to them yesterday. So they've been manufacturing these vaccines in the background, millions of doses of them, without knowing whether the vaccine was going to work, so that we would have it in a hurry. Now, you're going to look at that and you're going to say, well, that's a lot of money. And you're right. Except that the amount of money that the economy is losing every day is about what all of this vaccine development, 5 billion doses, is going to cost. So on an absolute scale, most of us look at how much this vaccine early production stuff is costing and have our breath taken away. But on a relative scale of how important it is to do, it's nothing. So people have really done all the work. It's just been in a very compressed time frame. Now, there's a couple of things that people are going to be worried about with new vaccines. The first is how long they're going to last, okay? And the answer is, when we start a vaccine program, we never know that, okay? We have some ideas based on what we know about the disease and antibodies, and for most diseases, since we know more, we know a bit more than we know about COVID, but we don't generally know. So if you think about it, we introduced measles vaccine, and after we've been using it for 10 years, we figured out that one dose wasn't good enough for long enough, and we needed a second dose. Okay, so we adjusted. We've got 2 different shingles vaccines. We don't know how long they last. We're going to find out, and when we find out, we'll adjust the dosing if we need it. But we don't go into vaccine programs knowing how long vaccines are going to last. We go into vaccine programs saying, we know we can protect people from the short term, and we'll figure out the long term as we go. And the second thing that people are worried about are adverse events. Okay, and very rare adverse events can occur with vaccines, and most of these vaccines have now been given to 30 or 40,000 people, and that's a lot, but it's not enough to be absolutely sure that there's not some very rare adverse event. And there's 2 things that I think people need to know about that. Somebody brought up the 1976 swine flu and Guillain-Barré epidemics, and we know a lot more about vaccines than we did in 1976. So not that there's no risk, but there's significantly less risk than there was. And the second thing is that COVID is not a non-serious disease. So what you have to think about when you're thinking about getting a vaccine is not necessarily the risk associated with the vaccine, but how that risk compares to what happens if you don't get the vaccine. So all of us who are not yet infected are going to be infected in the next 2 or 3 years if we don't get vaccinated. So for someone like me who's over 65, I'm going to get COVID sometime in the next 5 years. And if I get COVID, just by the numbers, there's a 1 in 20 chance that I'm going to die. So realistically, what I'm looking at without a vaccine is a 1 in 20 chance that I'm going to die from COVID. Measured up against that, a 1 in 5 million chance that I'm going to get some serious complication from the vaccine really doesn't matter. So the reason for these vaccines is because we all need protection against what is a significant threat to our health. Having said that, the other thing that people need to know is that we are going to be very focused on collecting data very quickly on vaccine safety. And so, you know, the UK is starting their vaccination program next Monday. So by the time we start vaccines in Canada, even if it's 2 weeks from now, there'll probably be 1 million people vaccinated in the UK. And so we're going to get safety data very, very quickly to know that these vaccines are okay. Next slide.
That's the end of your slide.
That's the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for
Thank you. There is a question that has come up for you. Would there be any value in antibody testing prior to vaccination?
No. So for 2 reasons. The first is that the main reason is that very few people have been infected in Canada. Okay, so that's a little different in some places in the United States, where as many as 15% of people have been infected. But in Canada, fewer than 5% of people have. So you'd be doing antibody testing to detect the 1 or 2 people out of 100 who had some antibodies. And the second reason is that if you don't know you've had COVID, then you probably had a mild case of COVID. And mild cases are known not to result in as good antibody development as more serious cases. So people who've had mild cases probably want to get vaccinated anyway. So I think the answer is we're not going to do antibody testing before COVID vaccines. That might be different for people who've had COVID. I don't think we know what the right thing to do is for people who've been infected with COVID. And I think we're gonna have to wait for some public health recommendations on that. To my mind, if you've had COVID, then it might be sensible to get your antibodies tested, and if they're positive, just to wait for a while to see how things sort themselves out. On the other hand, there's probably absolutely no harm in getting vaccinated if you've had COVID. So people who have had COVID and want to get vaccinated, I wouldn't hesitate to offer them vaccine.
Thank you. The next question is, for the Pfizer vaccine, is there still a requirement for very cold storage? How will we manage this? What are they doing in the UK to manage this? And how long can it be kept out of this intense cold?
So both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, one of the problems with messenger RNA is it's not very stable, which is why you need the deep freezers for it. And Moderna is a little better than Pfizer. Moderna can be kept for a month at refrigerator temperature as opposed to minus 80 degrees. The Pfizer vaccine can only be kept for 5 days out of the freezer. So it is logistically challenging. And my guess is that we're going to be trying to centralize the delivery of Pfizer vaccines. And in hospitals, it's relatively easy, because in hospitals, most of us have minus 80 degree freezers that we can, say, steal from researchers for the purpose, you know, thaw them, clean them out, and repurpose them for medications for a couple of months. The government has bought, you can't actually buy a minus 80 degree freezer at the moment because governments are buying them up for their vaccine programs. And so I think we'll do something centralized where we'll have large clinics so that people can get their vaccine. It'll be a little bit less convenient for people getting their vaccine, but maybe necessary because of the cold. And then I see there's a question about mandatory vaccines. I think whether vaccines will be required or not is going to have to wait the test of time. My guess would be not, because we are reluctant to do so. I think what might happen is that it would be like flu, so you don't have to be vaccinated, but if an outbreak happens, you can't work until the outbreak is over. I suppose technically it might go as far as, if the community cases of COVID in your community are above a certain level and you're not vaccinated, maybe you wouldn't be able to work. I think that would only happen if there were sort of established outbreaks after people are vaccinated. And we have and generally speaking, without requiring vaccination for residents, for flu, say, we have vaccination rates that are high enough that it's okay. So I think we're going to start with voluntary programs, and then we're going to ask what the evidence is that those programs are enough, and whether there's evidence that we might need to require some people to be vaccinated in some circumstances.